Sweden has been a country that has been militarily neutral for over 200 years, ever since the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars. Since Sweden is applying for membership in NATO, that neutrality would come to an end, but a streak of over 200 years, including through both world wars, is something not too many other countries can boast. However, what neutrality truly means is a bit debated, and Sweden was close to breaking that neutrality streak towards the end of World War II. To understand why, let's look at Sweden's situation during World War II. Sweden never officially joined the Allied powers or the Axis powers, and unlike their neighbor Finland, they didn't become a co-belligerent with either side in some sort of weird third-way loophole either. Despite this, there were many disputes as to whether Sweden was truly neutral during World War II. From Sweden's perspective, they were focused on neutrality in the sense of staying out of physical conflict with their neighbors and keeping themselves from bringing that war to them. This meant they would continue trading with Nazi Germany, not just due to economic worries, but to not give Germany a reason to invade them. Iron ore in particular was something Nazi Germany's war machine was dependent on, and theoretically if Sweden stopped giving it to Germany, they wouldn't have been as effective in the early years of the war as they were. However, the idea of Germany invading Sweden to ensure that access to that resource was not unheard of. The main reason Germany invaded Sweden's other neighbors of Norway and Denmark was to prevent a blockade of their access to iron ore in Sweden through Norwegian ports. It also protected the shipping route of that iron ore into the Baltic Sea. If Germany was willing to do that, invading Sweden was a possibility Sweden couldn't ignore. Sweden, however, would also help the Allies when it could, but without entering the war. They provided a lot of intelligence to the Allies, and they also would train Norwegian and Danish resistance soldiers. But this weird middle ground was criticized by others as a way to profit off of both sides in the war to their benefit, rather than truly protecting their neutrality. Some also said that continuing trade with Nazi Germany was immoral whether there was a threat of invasion or not, as their role was so essential to Germany's war machine, they were basically just helping one side. Overall, the question on whether Sweden was truly neutral during World War II is something historians have debated. But for a brief moment, there was a chance that this ambiguity would be entirely broken by Sweden outright entering the war. The idea of being neutral to not provoke the Axis powers invading them was a valid concern towards the beginning of the war, but as Germany collapsed in the final years of the war, many previously neutral nations joined the Allied powers. Sweden was going to be one of those last-minute Allied powers, and while they were eager to no longer have to deal with Nazi Germany, the major reason was fear of the Soviets. The Soviet Union had been the prime liberator for the Eastern Front as they pushed Germany back, and it was becoming clear that they would have significant influence over large portions of Europe after the war. The question was, how far west would that influence be? There was question in the final months of the war on whether the Soviets or the Western Allies would reach the heart of Germany first, and while that was an open possibility, there was a similar question in the same way to Scandinavia. With Finland defeated, the Soviets were already pushing the Germans out of Lapland in northern Norway, and if they reached eastern Germany, they could potentially move on to Denmark. The idea of a pro-Soviet Denmark or Norway would give the Soviets a key advantage after the war, and Sweden preferred to not be under the pressure of the Soviets like they were with the Germans. So they agreed to plan a military operation to liberate Denmark and possibly even Norway before the Soviets could. Operation Rädda Danmark, or Save Denmark, would involve 60,000 men made up of around 4,000 trained Danish soldiers and 56,000 Swedish soldiers, including an armored brigade, 6,000 vehicles, and 100 naval vessels. And of course there would be Swedish air support. Part of this force would land on the island of Bornholm due to its strategic midpoint in the Baltic Sea, while the other would land on Zealand, the island with the Danish capital of Copenhagen. They were expecting to face 28,000 Germans on Zealand and 12,000 Germans on Bornholm. Should they succeed, they'd at least block the Soviets from moving further west in the Baltic Sea, and ideally the Western Allies could move into mainland Denmark. Operation Rädda Norway, or Save Norway, was based on a plan if Germany did ever end up declaring war on Sweden, and has been semi-planned, at least in part, since 1943. It would utilize around 250,000 Swedish and Norwegian soldiers, along with around 370 tanks, and of course Swedish air support. There would be a three-pronged invasion towards the Norwegian cities of Trondheim, Mo i Rana, and of course the capital of Oslo. Unlike Save Denmark, in this case the Swedes would be outnumbered by the approximately 350,000 Germans occupying Norway. But there was hope the German morale would be low and their supply lines would be weaker, and that would somehow even the odds. So why did these operations end up never happening? Sweden waited a bit too long and it ended up just not being necessary. Sweden approved conducting Operation Save Denmark first and set the invasion date for May 18th. Germany would end up surrendering 10 days before that, and while the German forces in Norway held out for a few extra days, they too ended up surrendering. This allowed the Western Allies to liberate those countries without having to plan a full invasion at all. While the Soviets didn't end up occupying all of Norway or Denmark, they did end up defeating the German force on the island of Bornholm and occupied the island on May 9th, the German troops having not been able to receive the news of the surrender the day before. So even if Germany didn't surrender when it did, Operation Save Denmark would have needed slight alterations. So in the end, Sweden's neutrality just remained questionable instead of entirely broken, and they never technically entered the war. But it would have been an interesting moment if they did. I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I'll see you guys next time.